Picture driving home after a grueling 80-hour work week, completely at peace in your brand new, hard-earned luxury SUV, only to have flashing red and blue lights shatter your sanctuary. For Eleanor, a late-night traffic stop quickly devolved into a nightmare of profiling, arrogance, and unlawful detainment by a cop with a massive chip on his shoulder. But Officer Thorne made one catastrophic mistake. He didn't realize the quiet black woman he just placed in handcuffs was one of the most ruthless federal prosecutors in the district, and her revenge was entirely legal. The dashboard clock of the 2026 Midnight Blue Lexus LX 600 read 11:42 p.m. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was a sanctuary of soft leather, climate-controlled air, and the faint, soothing notes of a Miles Davis trumpet solo playing through the bespoke sound system. Eleanor Vance exhaled a long, measured breath, letting the tension of the past 2 weeks melt into the driver's seat. At 34, Eleanor was the youngest Assistant United States Attorney, AUSA, in the Northern District, specializing in organized crime and public corruption. For the last 14 days, she had been buried under a mountain of subpoenas, wiretap transcripts, and grand jury testimonies. Today, she had finally secured a massive indictment against a local syndicate. To celebrate, she had finally picked up the SUV she'd ordered 6 months prior from Sanderson Lexus. The vehicle still smelled of showroom polish. The temporary paper dealer plates were taped securely to the rear window, glowing faintly whenever she passed beneath the amber streetlights of Silver Creek Drive. Silver Creek was an affluent, quiet enclave, lined with ancient oak trees and sprawling colonial homes. It was also where Eleanor had just closed on a beautiful 4-bedroom house, a testament to her relentless work ethic and the sacrifices she had made climbing the brutal ladder of the Department of Justice. As she turned onto Elmwood Avenue, just 3 blocks from her new driveway, the tranquil darkness of her rearview mirror was violently shattered. Red and blue strobe lights erupted. The piercing chirp of a police siren demanded immediate submission. Eleanor's heart executed a brief, involuntary stutter, a biological reaction to the sudden adrenaline, but her mind remained entirely clinical. She was a woman who dismantled hostile witnesses for a living. A traffic stop was a minor inconvenience, not a crisis. She signaled calmly, easing the heavy SUV to the right shoulder, parking flawlessly under the illumination of a street lamp. She shifted into park, turned off the engine, and rolled down the driver's side window. She placed both hands at the 10 and 2 position on the steering wheel, her leather wallet resting visibly on the dashboard, exactly as she had been taught. In the side mirror, she watched the squad car's door swing open. Out stepped Officer Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a 12-year veteran of the local municipal force. He was built like a cinder block, with a tight buzz cut and a swagger that spoke volumes about how he viewed his authority. Within the department, Thorne was known as a hard charger, a euphemism for a cop who routinely skirted the edges of probable cause to make a bust. He had a history of excessive force complaints, all quietly buried by a police union that protected its own. Tonight, he was patrolling an upscale neighborhood, looking for anything that didn't fit. And in Thorne's deeply prejudiced worldview, a young black woman driving a $120,000 luxury vehicle with temporary plates in Silver Creek didn't fit. Thorne approached the vehicle not with the standard caution of a routine traffic stop, but with the aggressive, angled stance of a predator. He unclipped the retention strap on his holster. He clicked on his heavy-duty maglite, shining the blinding beam directly into Eleanor's eyes, ignoring the ambient light from the street lamp that already illuminated the cabin perfectly. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," Thorne barked, his voice dripping with an unwarranted hostility that immediately put Eleanor on high alert. Squinting against the glaring beam, Eleanor did not flinch. "Good evening, officer. My license is in my wallet on the dashboard. The registration and insurance are in the glove compartment. With your permission, I will reach for them now." Her voice was steady, modulated, and entirely devoid of fear. It was the voice of a federal prosecutor addressing a judge, though Thorne lacked the intellectual bandwidth to recognize the cadence of authority. "Just get the papers and keep your hands where I can see them," Thorne snapped, stepping closer, his flashlight beam sweeping over the pristine leather interior, lingering on Eleanor's designer briefcase, resting on the passenger seat. Moving deliberately, Eleanor retrieved her driver's license, then reached across to pop the glove box. She handed him the crisp, newly printed temporary registration and her insurance card. Thorne snatched them from her hand. He didn't even look at the documents initially. His eyes were boring into her, searching for the nervous tells of a criminal. He found none. Eleanor sat perfectly still, her dark eyes locking onto his with a terrifying, unblinking calm. "Whose car is this?" Thorne demanded, finally shining his light onto the temporary registration. "It is my vehicle, officer. As you can see on the registration you are currently holding, it is registered to Eleanor Vance. That matches the driver's license." Thorne scoffed, a wet, ugly sound. "Yeah, I can read. But paper tags are easy to fake. We've had a rash of high-end vehicle thefts in this area. A lot of folks coming in from the city, taking things that don't belong to them." The implication hung in the crisp night air, heavy and toxic. Folks from the city. It was thinly veiled code, a dog whistle that Eleanor had heard 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways. "I purchased the vehicle this afternoon from Sanderson Lexus, officer. If you run the VIN, which is visible at the base of the windshield, dispatch will confirm the temporary registration is valid in the state database." Thorne leaned in closer, his face inches from the window. The smell of stale coffee and peppermint gum wafted into the car. "I didn't ask for legal advice. I asked whose car this really is. Because people who look like you don't drive cars like this around here unless they're lost. Or unless they're driving a stolen ride." Eleanor's blood ran cold, not with fear, but with a sudden, absolute clarity. The legal machinery in her mind engaged with the smooth, lethal precision of a sniper chambering a round. Fourth Amendment violation, brewing. Lack of reasonable, articulable suspicion. Racial profiling. Civil rights deprivation under color of law. She was no longer just a driver trying to get home. She was a federal attorney observing a crime being committed against her. And she was going to let him dig his grave as deep as he possibly could. "Officer," Eleanor said, her tone dropping an octave, becoming colder than the October wind. "I have provided you with a valid, state-issued identification. I have provided valid proof of ownership and insurance. Am I being detained for a traffic violation, or am I free to go?" Thorne's jaw clenched. He was used to panic. He was used to anger. He was used to people begging, crying, or losing their temper, which gave him the excuse he needed to escalate. The icy, robotic defiance of the woman in front of him felt like a direct challenge to his manhood and his badge. "You're not going anywhere," Thorne growled. "Step out of the vehicle." The demand to step out of the vehicle was legally permissible under Pennsylvania versus Mims, a Supreme Court ruling Eleanor knew by heart. Officers could order a driver out of a vehicle during a lawful traffic stop for officer safety. But this was not a lawful traffic stop. Thorne had no initial probable cause to pull her over. She hadn't been speeding, she hadn't run a light, and her temporary tags were perfectly displayed. "Officer," Eleanor said, her voice echoing the eerie calm of a ticking bomb. "I will comply with your order to step out of the vehicle. However, I want it noted for the record that I am doing so under duress, and I am asking you to articulate the reasonable suspicion that initiated this traffic stop." Thorne's eyes widened in sheer, incredulous rage. "Note it for the record? Who the hell do you think you are? You don't ask the questions here. Step out of the damn car before I pull you out." Eleanor unbuckled her seatbelt slowly. She opened the heavy door and stepped out onto the asphalt. She was wearing a tailored charcoal grey Tom Ford suit, a silk blouse, and modest heels. She stood at 5'8", her posture impeccably straight, exuding a quiet power that momentarily threw Thorne off balance. But his ego quickly violently overrode his instincts. "Turn around and face the vehicle. Hands on the roof," Thorne commanded, stepping into her personal space, his hand hovering dangerously over his service weapon. Eleanor complied, placing her palms flat against the cool metal of the Lexus. "I am complying with your physical commands," she stated clearly, projecting her voice so the dash cam on Thorne's cruiser would pick up the audio. "I do not consent to any searches of my person or my vehicle. I am unarmed. I am not a threat." "Shut up!" Thorne barked. He grabbed her wrists with unnecessary bruising force, yanking her arms behind her back. The cold, heavy steel of Smith & Wesson handcuffs bit aggressively into Eleanor's wrists as he ratcheted them tight, much too tight. The metal pinched her skin, sending sharp jolts of pain up her forearms. "Officer, the cuffs are excessively tight. They are cutting off my circulation," Eleanor noted, her voice maintaining that unnerving, objective detachment. "They're handcuffs, not jewelry," Thorne sneered, patting her down with rough, intrusive hands. He found nothing but her keys. "Are you arresting me?" Eleanor asked. "And if so, what is the specific criminal charge?" Thorne grabbed her by the bicep, spinning her around and shoving her roughly against the side of the Lexus. "I'm detaining you for investigation of grand theft auto, possession of stolen property, and driving a vehicle with fraudulent tags. And I guarantee you, when I search this car, I'm going to find the drugs or the guns you're moving." "I have explicitly denied consent to search my vehicle," Eleanor repeated, staring dead into his eyes. "Without a warrant or probable cause, any search you conduct is a direct violation of my Fourth Amendment rights. Furthermore, there are legally privileged documents in that vehicle." Thorne laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He genuinely thought she was a low-level criminal trying to regurgitate legal jargon she'd heard on television. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Thorne mocked. "You watch a couple episodes of Law and Order and think you can talk your way out of a felony stop. I don't need your consent. The fake tags give me probable cause." He pushed her away from the car, marching her toward the back of his cruiser. He opened the rear door and shoved her inside the molded plastic seat. It was cramped, reeking of sweat, vomit, and heavy institutional disinfectant. The door slammed shut, locking her in the cage. Through the plexiglass divider, Eleanor watched as Thorne walked back to her pristine Lexus. He opened the driver's side door and climbed in. Eleanor's eyes narrowed in the darkness of the cruiser. In her briefcase on the passenger seat were physical case files for United States versus Moretti, a high-level racketeering case. While the most sensitive grand jury materials were digitally encrypted on her federal laptop, there were still confidential DOJ memos, witness lists, and federal agent contact sheets in those folders. By searching that car, Thorne wasn't just violating her civil rights. He was unlawfully accessing restricted federal law enforcement materials. He was crossing a line that local cops didn't just get fired for. They went to federal prison for. Thorne spent 10 minutes tearing apart her new car. He rummaged through the center console, dumping her charging cables and mints onto the floorboards. He tore the glove compartment apart. Finally, he grabbed her sleek leather briefcase. Eleanor watched as he popped the brass clasps. He pulled out thick stacks of legal paper, flipping through them carelessly, looking for cash or contraband, completely oblivious to the United States Department of Justice letterhead printed on every single page. He tossed the files onto the passenger seat in a disorganized mess. Finding no drugs, no guns, and no massive stacks of illicit cash, Thorne slammed the car door shut. He stormed back to the cruiser, His face flushed with frustration, he slid into the driver's seat, slamming his hands against the steering wheel. "Nothing in the car?" he muttered into his radio, keying the mic for dispatch. "But the tags are definitely fake. The paper feels off. I'm bringing the suspect in for processing. Send a tow truck to my location. Impound the vehicle. Impound the vehicle." Eleanor took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cold steel of the handcuffs digging into her wrists. He was actually going to do it. He was stealing her car under the guise of the law. "Officer Thorne," Eleanor spoke through the small grate in the plexiglass. "I highly advise you to run the VIN through NCIC before you tow my vehicle. It will take you exactly 45 seconds, and it will save you your career." Thorne whipped his head around, glaring at her through the grate. "Listen to me, you arrogant piece of trash. You don't tell me how to do my job. You're going to a holding cell, and tomorrow you're going to county. You're done." He slammed the cruiser into drive and peeled away from the curb, leaving the beautiful, legally purchased Lexus stranded on the side of the road, waiting for a tow truck to drag it away. Eleanor sat in the darkness of the back seat as the squad car sped through the night. She didn't say another word. She didn't need to. The trap was fully set, and the prey had eagerly locked himself inside. The West Side precinct was a brutalist block of concrete that had seen better days. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed with an irritating, incessant hum. The air smelled of old coffee, stale cigarette smoke drifting in from the back alley, and the distinct, sour odor of human desperation. At 12:15 a.m., the holding area was chaotic. Two men were screaming at each other in a holding cell, while a public defender looked exhausted in the corner. Behind the high-elevated booking desk sat Desk Sergeant David Miller. Miller was a 20-year veteran with a graying mustache, a man who had survived 2 decades in law enforcement by knowing when to keep his head down and when to intervene. He was tired, looking forward to his pension, and currently nursing a lukewarm cup of terrible coffee. The heavy steel security doors buzzed and clattered open. Officer Thorne strode in, his chest puffed out, practically dragging Eleanor by the chain of her handcuffs. Despite being manhandled, Eleanor walked with a terrifying poise. Her charcoal suit was slightly wrinkled, and her wrists were bleeding slightly where the metal had cut into the skin, but her posture was flawless. Her chin was held high, her eyes scanning the room, absorbing every detail, every face, every badge number. "What do we got, Thorne?" Sergeant Miller asked, sighing as he booted up the booking computer. "It's late. Tell me this is an easy one." "Grand theft auto, possession of stolen property, fraudulent documents," Thorne declared loudly, making sure the other officers in the bullpen heard him. "Caught her driving a brand-new Lexus LX 600 up in Silver Creek, slapped some fake dealership tags on it, refused to cooperate. Think we might have a ring operating out of the east side." Miller peered down over the desk at Eleanor. He frowned. Usually, car thieves brought in at midnight were tweaking on methamphetamine, wearing dirty clothes, and screaming obscenities. The woman standing before him looked like she belonged on the cover of Forbes. There was an icy, impenetrable aura around her that made Miller's veteran instincts scream that something was fundamentally wrong. "Name?" Miller asked, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Eleanor looked up at the desk sergeant. "My name is Eleanor Vance. I am invoking my right to remain silent regarding any and all questions related to this fabricated investigation. I am invoking my right to legal counsel. The only statements I will make will be regarding the illegal search of my vehicle, the excessive force used in my detainment, and the denial of my civil liberties by Officer Thorne." Thorne slammed his hand on the booking desk. "See, this is the attitude I've been dealing with since I pulled her over. Thinks she's a damn lawyer." Miller didn't flinch. He kept his eyes on Eleanor. The way she spoke, the precise articulation, the exact legal phrasing without a stutter. It wasn't the rambling of a sovereign citizen or a street criminal trying to act smart. It was professional. "All right, Thorne, empty her pockets. Give me her ID," Miller said, his voice dropping slightly. "She didn't have anything on her. Left her wallet in the car," Thorne sneered. "I brought it with me to log into evidence." Thorne reached into his tactical cargo pocket and pulled out Eleanor's sleek, black leather wallet. He tossed it onto the metal booking counter. It landed with an unusually heavy thud. "Let's see who she really is," Thorne said, unzipping the wallet. Eleanor stood perfectly still. The corners of her mouth twitched upwards by a fraction of a millimeter. A predator's smile. Thorne flipped the wallet open. There, gleaming under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of the booking desk, was not just a driver's license. It was a heavy, solid gold shield. The eagle clutching the arrows. The deep blue enamel. The bold, unmissable lettering that wrapped around the seal. United States Department of Justice. Assistant United States Attorney. Next to the badge was her official federal identification card. It bore her photograph, the Great Seal of the United States, and the signature of the Attorney General. Silence descended on the booking desk. It was sudden, absolute, and suffocating. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights suddenly sounded as loud as a chainsaw. Thorne stared at the badge. His brain, clouded by years of unchecked arrogance and implicit bias, simply refused to process the visual information for a full 5 seconds. He blinked. He leaned in closer, his breathing suddenly stopping. What is this?" Thorne muttered, his voice losing every ounce of its previous bravado. It sounded thin, weak. Sergeant Miller leaned over the high desk to look at the wallet. The blood instantly drained from Miller's face, leaving him as pale as a ghost. He looked from the gold badge up to Eleanor's cold, impassive face, and then down to her hands, which were currently bound in handcuffs behind her back. "Oh, sweet Jesus," Miller whispered. "It's a fake," Thorne stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the shield. "It's got to be a fake. She bought it online to get out of tickets." "Officer Thorne," Eleanor finally spoke, her voice ringing out clearly in the dead, silent room. "That badge is real, as is the federal identification card beside it. I am the lead prosecutor for the organized crime and gang section of the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District. And you, officer, have just committed false arrest, unlawful detainment, assault, battery, and an illegal search and seizure of federal property." Thorne took a step back, bumping into a filing cabinet. No, you were driving a stolen car." "I bought that car at 3 p.m. today," Eleanor said, stepping slightly toward him, forcing him to shrink back. "If you had bothered to run the VIN, like I instructed you to, you would have seen it registered to my name. Instead, you decided to profile me, illegally search a vehicle containing restricted federal grand jury materials, and tow it." Sergeant Miller sprang into action. "Thorne, get those cuffs off her, right now!" "Sarge, she's lying!" Thorne pleaded, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an ally and finding only horrified stares from the other officers who had slowly stopped what they were doing to watch a career self-destruct in real time. "I said get the cuffs off her, you idiot!" Miller roared, his voice cracking with panic. "Do you know who she is? She's the federal prosecutor who put away the Diablos gang last year. Get them off her!" Thorne's hands were shaking violently as he fumbled for his handcuff keys. He approached Eleanor like a man walking to the gallows. He reached behind her, his fingers slipping on the metal as he tried to unlock the cuffs. "Do not touch me," Eleanor commanded. The sheer authority in her voice stopped Thorne dead in his tracks. She looked past the trembling officer, up at the desk sergeant. "Sergeant Miller," Is it?" "Yes, ma'am," Miller stammered. "A USA, Vance. I am so deeply sorry for this." "Save the apologies, Sergeant. I want your shift commander down here immediately. I want Internal Affairs contacted, and I want the FBI field office notified that a local police officer has unlawfully accessed and compromised federal grand jury files. Furthermore, these handcuffs stay on until your captain physically removes them and views the lacerations Officer Thorne has caused to my wrists." Thorne looked like he was going to vomit. His face had gone from red to white to a sickly shade of grey. "Miss Vance, I made a mistake. I thought—" "You didn't think, Officer Thorne," Eleanor cut him off, her voice devoid of any sympathy or mercy. "You saw a black woman in a luxury car, and your prejudice made the decisions for you. You felt powerful on the side of that road. You felt invincible." Eleanor took a step closer to him, her eyes locking onto his terrified gaze. "Let's see how powerful you feel when you are sitting at the defense table in a federal courtroom." The West Side precinct, usually a chaotic hub of midnight processing and bureaucratic apathy, had descended into the kind of silence usually reserved for a mausoleum. The ambient buzzing of the overhead fluorescent lights seemed to amplify the crushing tension in the room. Desk Sergeant Miller stood frozen behind his elevated counter, his hand hovering over the telephone, unsure of who to call first to stop the bleeding of his department's reputation. Officer Marcus Thorne was leaning heavily against a filing cabinet, his face buried in his hands. The aggressive, chest-thumping swagger he had paraded on Silver Creek Drive was completely gone, replaced by the trembling, hyperventilating reality of a man who had just thrown his entire life into an industrial shredder. At 12:40 a.m., the heavy reinforced glass doors of the precinct swung open with a violent crash. Captain Robert Callahan practically jogged into the bullpen. Callahan was a 30-year veteran, a man who had survived the political minefields of the city police department by running a tight, disciplined ship. He had been yanked from a deep sleep by a frantic, breathless phone call from Miller. Over his unbuttoned uniform shirt, he wore a hastily thrown-on trench coat. Callahan's eyes swept the room and instantly landed on Eleanor. She was still standing in the exact same spot, her posture impeccably straight, her wrists still securely bound behind her back in Thorne's tight steel cuffs. She looked like a marble statue of justice, immovable, cold, and entirely unforgiving. "Jesus Christ," Callahan breathed out, his face turning an ashen grey. He recognized her immediately. Everyone in local law enforcement knew Eleanor Vance. She was the federal prosecutor who had single-handedly dismantled the highly dangerous Los Reyes cartel operation on the East Side just 6 months prior. She was notoriously brilliant, unshakable, and completely devoid of patience for police incompetence. "Ms. Vance, a USA Vance," Callahan stammered, closing the distance between them quickly. "I am profoundly sorry. This is a catastrophic misunderstanding." Callahan reached out to guide her toward a chair, but Eleanor took a sharp half-step back. "Do not touch me, Captain Callahan." Eleanor's voice was smooth, carrying the lethal chill of a winter wind. "There is no misunderstanding here. A misunderstanding is a clerical error on a warrant. What your officer did tonight was a targeted, racially motivated deprivation of my civil rights under color of law. He unlawfully detained me, physically assaulted me, and illegally searched my vehicle, which contained highly classified federal grand jury materials." Callahan whipped his head around to glare at Thorne, looking at the junior officer as if he wanted to strangle him with his bare hands. "You searched her vehicle? You opened her federal files?" "Cap, I thought the tags were fake," Thorne whimpered, his voice cracking. "She had a temporary plate. It's protocol." "Shut your mouth before you make this worse," Callahan roared, the veins bulging in his neck. He turned back to Eleanor, his hands raised placatingly. "Ma'am, please, let me take those handcuffs off you. We can go into my office, get you some water, and sort this out. You will remove these handcuffs, Captain. But you will do so meticulously," Eleanor commanded. "Sergeant Miller, I want you to grab the precinct's digital camera. You are going to document the lacerations and deep tissue bruising your officer caused when he purposefully over-tightened these restraints as a punitive measure." Miller didn't hesitate. He scrambled behind the desk, producing a heavy Nikon DSLR camera used for booking evidence. As Callahan carefully unlocked the cuffs, Eleanor winced slightly, the only display of physical discomfort she had shown all night. The heavy steel fell away, revealing angry, bleeding purple indentations carved deep into her wrists. Miller snapped several high-resolution photographs, the bright flash illuminating Thorne's horrified face in the background. "Now," Eleanor said, gently rubbing her wrists to restore circulation. "Where is the FBI? I instructed Sergeant Miller to contact the field office." As if on cue, the precinct doors opened again. This time there was no chaotic rushing. The entry was deliberate, heavy, and radiated absolute authority. 3 men in sharp, dark suits entered the bullpen, their FBI credentials hanging prominently on lanyards around their necks. Leading the trio was Special Agent in Charge, SAC, Thomas Sterling. Sterling was a towering, broad-shouldered man with a military buzz cut and eyes that had seen decades of organized crime and corruption. He was Eleanor's primary liaison on the United States versus Moretti racketeering case, the very files that Thorne had carelessly poured through. "Eleanor," SAC Sterling said, his voice a deep, calming rumble. He looked at her bruised wrists and then shifted his gaze to the local cops. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "Are you all right?" "I am physically fine, Tom," Eleanor replied, her professional demeanor unwavering. "However, the integrity of the Moretti investigation has been compromised. Officer Thorne unlawfully searched my vehicle and handled the physical witness lists and grand jury indictments." Sterling's jaw tightened. He turned his attention to Captain Callahan, who was actively sweating through his shirt. "Captain," Sterling said, his tone devoid of any professional courtesy, "your officer has just committed a federal felony. He has unlawfully accessed restricted government documents, tampered with a federal investigation, and violated 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. The Bureau is officially taking jurisdiction of this incident. Agent Sterling, we can handle this internally." Callahan started to protest weakly. "No, you can't," Sterling interrupted flatly. He looked past Callahan, pointing a massive finger directly at Thorne. "Officer Marcus Thorne, you are under arrest by the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Thorne let out a pathetic, suffocated gasp. No, wait. I have union representation. I want my union rep." "You can call your rep from Federal Holding," one of the junior FBI agents stated, stepping forward. He aggressively grabbed Thorne's arms, spinning him around and snapping a pair of federal cuffs onto his wrists. The poetic justice of the metallic click echoed loudly in the silent precinct. "Captain Callahan," Eleanor said, picking up her gold shield and DOJ ID from the booking counter and slipping them back into her wallet. "I suggest you secure Officer Thorne's body camera, his dash camera, and all precinct surveillance footage immediately. If a single frame of data goes missing, I will personally see to it that you are indicted for obstruction of justice alongside him." With that, Eleanor turned on her heel and walked out of the West Side precinct, flanked by SAC Sterling, leaving the local police department drowning in the catastrophic wake of their own hubris. The next morning, the sun rose over a city completely unaware of the institutional earthquake that had occurred during the night. But inside the halls of power, The aftershocks were already tearing structures apart. At 6 a.m., a convoy of blacked-out FBI Suburbans breached the gates of the city municipal impound lot. Federal agents, armed with federal seizure warrants, signed by Chief Judge Harrison Miller of the Northern District, bypassed the local attendants entirely. They secured Eleanor's pristine Lexus LX 600, loaded it onto a flatbed truck, and transported it to a secure FBI evidence bay to be dusted for Thorne's fingerprints and swabbed for DNA, cementing the physical proof of his unlawful entry. By 9 a.m., the local media had caught wind of the story. A local beat reporter, tipped off by a dispatcher at the West Side precinct, published a breaking news article online. The headline spread like wildfire. Racist cop arrests federal prosecutor in Silver Creek. FBI takes over precinct. The response was swift, merciless, and terrifyingly thorough. Eleanor Vance did not just want Marcus Thorne fired. She wanted to dismantle the ecosystem that had allowed him to thrive. She recused herself from the direct prosecution to avoid a conflict of interest, handing the reins over to her trusted colleague, Deputy Chief Prosecutor Arthur Kirkland. Kirkland was a bulldog of a lawyer, a man who viewed civil rights violations with a deeply personal hatred. Thorne's situation deteriorated from a nightmare to an absolute legal apocalypse in record time. At 10 a.m., Thorne sat in a sterile federal interrogation room, looking small and defeated in a grey jumpsuit. Across from him sat his police union attorney, a man named Thomas O'Connor, who looked like he had aged 10 years overnight. "They're offering a plea deal, right?" Thorne asked, his voice trembling. "I get fired, I lose my pension, but no jail time. Right, Tommy?" O'Connor rubbed his temples, staring at the thick stack of files the federal prosecutors had just handed him in discovery. "Marcus, you don't understand the gravity of what you've done. They aren't offering a plea. They are going for maximum sentencing. They are hitting you with deprivation of civil rights, false imprisonment, and battery." "But it was a mistake," Thorne pleaded, tears welling in his eyes. "It wasn't a mistake," O'Connor snapped, losing his temper. "They pulled the metadata from your cruiser's computer. You didn't even run her temporary plates before you lit her up. You had zero probable cause. And it gets worse." O'Connor flipped open a file. "Because you compromised federal grand jury materials, the FBI executed a search warrant on your locker and your personal vehicle this morning. They found 3 unregistered drop guns and baggies of fentanyl in your trunk. The feds are saying you had a pattern and practice of planting evidence on suspects you unlawfully profiled." Thorne's face went entirely slack. The color drained from his skin as the reality of his doom finally settled in. His secret stash, the insurance he used to justify bad arrests on the East Side, had been uncovered. Meanwhile, at the district attorney's office, local DA Richard Kensington was engaged in a panicked, frantic damage control operation. Thorne's arrest by the FBI had triggered a Brady disclosure nightmare. Under the law, any evidence that compromises the credibility of a police officer must be disclosed to defense attorneys. Because Thorne was now a federally indicted felon accused of planting evidence and lying on official reports, his entire career was suddenly radioactive. Kensington stood before a podium at a hastily organized afternoon press conference, his face bathed in the flashing lights of camera shutters. "Effective immediately," Kensington announced, his voice tight with stress. "The district attorney's office is dropping all pending state charges in which Officer Marcus Thorne is the primary arresting officer or key witness. Furthermore, we are establishing an independent conviction integrity unit to review the last 12 years of Officer Thorne's closed cases. If we find that any citizen was wrongfully convicted based on his testimony, those convictions will be vacated." In the back of the press room, Eleanor Vance watched the broadcast on a small television monitor in the U.S. Attorney's office. She stood with her arms crossed, the bandages on her wrists hidden beneath the cuffs of a crisp white blazer. She felt no joy, no triumph. This wasn't a game. It was the grim, necessary excision of a tumor from the justice system. The police union, which usually fought tooth and nail to protect its officers from termination, abandoned Thorne completely by 3 p.m. The FBI had quietly informed the union brass that if they funded Thorne's legal defense or organized any protests, the Department of Justice would launch a massive RICO and pattern or practice investigation into the entire municipal police department's union finances. Faced with the threat of federal audits, the union cut Thorne loose, issuing a terse public statement condemning his actions. By the end of the day, Marcus Thorne was entirely isolated. His wife, disgusted by the revelations of his planted evidence and terrified of the impending financial ruin, packed her bags and left their home, taking their dog and moving in with her sister. His brothers in blue refused to take his phone calls, terrified that the FBI was tapping the lines. He was locked in a federal holding cell, denied bail by Judge Miller, who cited him as a flight risk and a danger to the community. He was staring down the barrel of 25 years in a federal penitentiary, the very place where the people he had wrongfully arrested had been sent. Karma had not just knocked on Marcus Thorne's door, it had kicked it off the hinges, executing a no-knock warrant on his entire existence, and it was completely, undeniably legal. The destruction of Marcus Thorne was swift, but Eleanor Vance knew that a tumor like Thorne did not grow in a vacuum. He was the product of a toxic environment, protected by a chain of command that prioritized the department's public image over the constitutional rights of the citizens they were sworn to protect. Thorne was the symptom, the West Side Precinct's leadership was the disease, and the Department of Justice was the cure. 2 weeks after the incident on Silver Creek Drive, a massive, unannounced audit swept through the local police department. The FBI, operating under the directive of the Civil Rights Division, seized decades of internal affairs records, use of force reports, and civilian complaint files. What they uncovered was a staggering, systemic pattern of corruption. Captain Robert Callahan, the man who had desperately tried to sweep Eleanor's arrest under the rug, was brought into the harsh light of federal scrutiny. Investigators found that over the past 6 years, Callahan had personally intervened to bury 4 separate complaints against Thorne. 3 of those complaints involved the excessive use of force against Black and Hispanic motorists during routine traffic stops. In each instance, Callahan had manipulated the internal review process, classifying the complaints as unfounded to protect his precinct's arrest statistics. On a rainy Tuesday morning, Deputy Chief Prosecutor Arthur Kirkland walked into Callahan's office, flanked by 2 armed federal agents. Kirkland dropped a thick, red-tagged folder onto the captain's mahogany desk. "Captain Callahan," Kirkland said, his voice echoing in the quiet office. "We have compiled sufficient evidence to indict you for conspiracy to deprive civil rights, obstruction of justice, and misprision of a felony. You shielded a predator with a badge, and you used your office to do it." Callahan, his face pale and deeply lined with the stress of the past 14 days, looked at the folder as if it were a live grenade. "Arthur, I dedicated 30 years to this city. I kept the streets clean. You can't do this to me. I'll lose everything. You lost the right to wear that uniform the moment you decided Thorne's career was worth more than the constitutional rights of the people he brutalized," Kirkland replied coldly. "The Attorney General is offering you one courtesy, and it is entirely for the sake of the city's stability. You will sign a full confession. You will resign your commission immediately. You will forfeit your entire taxpayer-funded pension. If you agree, you avoid federal prison. If you refuse, these agents will place you in handcuffs right now, and I will personally ensure you die in a federal penitentiary. Callahan's hands shook as he reached for his sterling silver pen. With a broken spirit and a shattered legacy, he signed his resignation and his confession. By noon, he was escorted out of the precinct by federal agents, stripped of his badge, his gun, and his dignity, in full view of the officers he had once commanded. But the karma hitting the department was only half the story. The Conviction Integrity Unit, established in the wake of Thorne's arrest, was working around the clock, reviewing hundreds of cases where Thorne had been the primary arresting officer. The discovery of the drop guns and narcotics in Thorne's trunk had poisoned the well of every arrest he had ever made. One case stood out: State versus Julian Hayes. 3 years prior, Julian Hayes, a 22-year-old college student, had been pulled over by Thorne for a broken tail light. Thorne claimed to have smelled marijuana, searched the vehicle, and miraculously found 2 ounces of cocaine in the trunk. Hayes had vehemently maintained his innocence, claiming the officer planted it. Despite having no prior record, Hayes was railroaded by Thorne's airtight, perjured testimony and sentenced to 8 years in state prison. His college scholarship was revoked, and his life was entirely derailed. When the FBI tested the plastic baggies found in Thorne's personal stash, the chemical composition of the narcotics and the manufacturing batch of the plastic matched the evidence used to convict Hayes perfectly. On a Friday afternoon, the heavy iron gates of the state penitentiary swung open. Julian Hayes walked out, blinking in the bright sunlight, wearing an oversized suit. He was greeted by his weeping mother and a pro bono civil rights attorney. Later that week, the city, terrified of the impending multi-million-dollar civil rights lawsuits, agreed to a massive, sweeping federal consent decree. The local police department would be stripped of its autonomy, forced to operate under strict, independent federal oversight for the next decade. Every traffic stop, every arrest, and every internal affairs complaint would be monitored by a federally appointed judge. Eleanor watched it all unfold from her office on the top floor of the federal courthouse. She hadn't just taken a bad cop off the street. She had triggered a legal avalanche that was systematically dismantling the corrupt machinery that had empowered him. But there was still one final piece of business left to conclude: Marcus Thorne's day in court. 7 months later, the United States District Court for the Northern District was packed to capacity. The polished oak gallery benches were filled with reporters, civil rights advocates, and several individuals who had been wrongfully arrested by the man currently sitting at the defense table. Marcus Thorne was unrecognizable. The bloated, aggressive swagger of a man who ruled the streets by fear had completely evaporated. He wore a standard-issue federal inmate jumpsuit, the bright orange fabric hanging loosely off his now gaunt frame. His hair was thinning, his skin was a sickly, pale gray, and his hands trembled continuously as they rested on the defense table. He had pled guilty. There was no other option. The dashcam footage, the audio recordings, the planted evidence found in his vehicle, and Callahan's written confession had created an insurmountable mountain of guilt. Today was his sentencing hearing. Presiding over the case was Chief Judge Harrison Miller, a man known for his fierce intellect and absolute intolerance for police corruption. "Mr. Thorne," Judge Miller's voice boomed through the courtroom, echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings. "You have pled guilty to 1 count of deprivation of rights under color of law, 1 count of evidence tampering, and 1 count of obstruction of a federal investigation. Before I pronounce your sentence, the court will hear from the victim. Assistant United States Attorney Vance, the floor is yours." Eleanor stood up from the front row of the gallery. She was dressed in a razor-sharp, navy blue suit, projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. She walked past the low wooden gate, approaching the podium that faced the judge. She didn't bring any notes. She didn't need them. She turned her head slightly, locking her dark, piercing eyes onto Thorne. Thorne couldn't meet her gaze. He stared down at his trembling hands, looking like a cornered rat. "Your Honor," Eleanor began, her voice clear, steady, and carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken injustices. "On the night of October 14th, Marcus Thorne didn't pull me over because he suspected a crime had been committed. He pulled me over because he saw a black woman driving a vehicle that his prejudice dictated I had no right to own. He viewed my existence in that neighborhood as an offense to his authority." The courtroom was dead silent. Every eye was locked on her. When I asserted my constitutional rights, he did what bullies always do when confronted with resistance. He resorted to violence. He placed me in handcuffs. He bruised my wrists. He illegally searched my property. And he did so with the arrogant certainty that the system would protect him. He believed that his badge was an impenetrable shield, granting him immunity to brutalize, to humiliate, and to destroy lives at his leisure. Eleanor took a step to the side of the podium, closing the distance between herself and the defense table. "But I was not the first, Your Honor. I was simply the first one with the power to stop him. For 12 years, Marcus Thorne weaponized the law against those who could not fight back. He planted narcotics on innocent college students. He destroyed families. He eroded the public's trust in law enforcement to a degree that this city may never fully recover from. He is not a rogue cop who made a mistake under pressure. He is a predator who used the color of law as a hunting license." She paused, letting the heavy, devastating truth settle over the room. "I am not asking for vengeance, Your Honor. I am asking for justice. I am asking this court to send a message so loud and so clear that it will ring in the ears of every corrupt officer in this country. No one is above the law, and those who wear a badge to break the law must be punished by it to the absolute maximum extent." Eleanor turned away from Thorne, looking back up at the bench. "The United States requests the maximum statutory penalty of 240 months in federal prison." Thorne let out a pathetic, stifled sob, dropping his head onto the table. Judge Miller adjusted his glasses, looking down at Thorne with absolute disgust. "Marcus Thorne," Judge Miller said, his voice cold and unforgiving. "You took an oath to protect the Constitution, and instead you used it as a rag to wipe your boots. You targeted a federal prosecutor out of pure, unadulterated hubris and racial animus. It is the profound irony of this court that the very woman you sought to unlawfully cage is the one who has permanently secured yours." The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel. "I sentence you to 240 months, 20 years in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. In the federal system, there is no parole. You will serve every single day of that sentence. You are remanded into custody immediately." Bang! The sound of the gavel striking the sound block was like a gunshot. Two massive U.S. Marshals immediately stepped forward. They grabbed Thorne by his arms, hauling him roughly to his feet. They pulled his arms behind his back, securing them with heavy, steel federal handcuffs. As they dragged him toward the side door leading to the holding cells, Thorne looked back over his shoulder. He locked eyes with Eleanor one last time. In her eyes, he found no pity, no anger, and no gloating. He found only the cold, unyielding wall of justice. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind him, sealing Marcus Thorne away from the world for the next 2 decades. That evening, the dashboard clock of the midnight blue Lexus LX 600 read 7:30 p.m. Eleanor Vance pulled the luxury SUV into the driveway of her beautiful new home on Silver Creek Drive. The evening air was calm. The faint, soothing notes of a Miles Davis trumpet solo played through the bespoke sound system. She turned off the engine, stepped out of the car, and took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. She had worked 80 hours this week. She was exhausted. But as she walked up to her front door, the heavy keys jingling in her hand, she felt a profound, unprecedented sense of peace. The streets were just a little bit safer tonight, and the law, in all its terrible, majestic power, had worked exactly as it was supposed to. Karma doesn't always wear a badge, but sometimes it carries a federal subpoena. Marcus Thorne thought he was the apex predator of his city's streets, completely unaware that his unchecked prejudice had led him straight into a legal bear trap. Eleanor Vance proved that the most devastating weapon against a corrupt system isn't anger. It's absolute, unwavering intelligence. Thorne wanted to ruin a life, and in the end, the only life he dismantled was his own. If you loved this story of instant karma and legal revenge, hit that like button, share this video with anyone who loves seeing justice served, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life stories where the bad guys get exactly what they deserve.